In the spring of 1961, at an estate sale outside of Pratt, Kansas, a 31-year-old woman named Nora Tillman paid $90 for a 1923 Aermotor windmill that hadn't turned in 11 years. The blades were there, most of them. 8 of the original 12 remained, the others having departed in some combination of wind events and simple oxidation. The steel so thin in places that a man's thumbnail could push through it without much effort. The tower legs were solid, which was something. 4 angle iron columns sunk in concrete that had outlasted the man who poured it. But the gearbox at the top was seized so completely that the local implement dealer had already looked at it twice and declined to offer a number. The pump rod was snapped 6 feet below grade, broken off in the casing sometime in the 1940s, and left there because pulling it required equipment the estate didn't own. The sucker rod was gone. The drop pipe had a visible crack at the 3rd joint. The tail vane was bent 40 degrees out of true, hanging at an angle that suggested the windmill had spent years pointing at something other than the wind. The auctioneer listed it between a hay rake with a broken tooth bar and 3 sections of rotted wooden fence post. He said, and these are approximately his words, that the windmill was being sold as is, where is, and that the new owner would be responsible for any costs associated with removal, which he wanted everyone to understand before the bidding opened at $50. A scrap dealer from Kingman County bid $55. Nora Tillman bid $60. The scrap dealer bid $65. Nora bid $70. The scrap dealer went to $75 and then looked at the tower and the broken pump rod and the gearbox and apparently decided that the math didn't work at any price because he shook his head and put his bidding card in his shirt pocket. Nora Tillman bid $90 into the silence, and the auctioneer called it sold before anyone else could reconsider. Her brother-in-law, Dale Tillman, had driven her to the sale in his pickup. He stood beside her while she signed the receipt, and he said, "Nora, what in the world are you going to do with that thing?" She folded her copy of the receipt and put it in her coat pocket. She said she was going to water cattle with it. Dale looked at the tower and the bent vane and the gearbox that 2 men and a come-along couldn't turn, and he didn't say anything else. But he told the story at the feed store in Pratt the following week, and the feed store told the co-op, and the co-op told the diner on Main Street, and by the time the story reached the church parking lot on Sunday, it had acquired the detail that Nora had paid $140, which wasn't true, but which the county preferred because it made the whole thing more satisfying to discuss. Let me tell you about Nora Tillman, because what she did with that windmill only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from, and what she had already decided about the way a farm ought to be run. Nora was born in 1930 on 480 acres of Pratt County shortgrass prairie that her grandfather had proved up in 1903, and her father, Clarence Buell, had inherited in 1931, which was possibly the worst year in the history of Kansas agriculture to inherit anything. Clarence was 26 years old when the land came to him, and the land was already in trouble. The aquifer was there. It had always been there. But nobody in Pratt County in 1931 had the equipment to reach it reliably, and the surface water had been declining for a decade, and the grass was going thin in the south pasture from overgrazing and drought, and the bank in Pratt was sending letters with increasing frequency. Clarence Buell did what he could. He sold 20 head of cattle he couldn't feed. He renegotiated the note twice. He planted a windbreak along the western fence line using seedlings he'd ordered from the state and hauled home in the back of a Model A, and he kept the forge. The forge had come with the property, built into a concrete-floored outbuilding behind the house by Nora's grandfather, who had been a working blacksmith in Ohio before he came west, and who had brought his tools with him, the way other men brought furniture. There was a coal forge with a hand-cranked blower, a 300 elb cast anvil on an oak stump, a post vise bolted to a workbench that ran the length of the south wall, and a collection of hammers, hardies, swages, and fullers that represented 40 years of a working blacksmith's accumulation. Clarence Buell had not been trained as a blacksmith, but he had grown up watching his father work, and he had learned what he needed to learn, which was enough. He could draw steel, bend it, punch it, weld it at the forge, and cut it with a hot chisel. He could fit bearings. He could machine simple parts on the small South Bend lathe he'd bought from a closing machine shop in Wichita in 1934 for $18, hauling it home in 2 trips because it was too heavy for one. He could look at a broken part and understand what it had been before it broke, and he could make another one. That was the education Nora Buell received, not formally, not with any announcement that this was what was happening. She simply spent her childhood in that shop, handing tools, pumping the blower, holding work while her father measured and adjusted, and absorbing without instruction the principle that governed everything Clarence Buell did. If you can make it yourself, you don't have to buy it. If you don't have to buy it, you don't have to borrow to pay for it. If you don't have to borrow, nobody can take the thing away from you when the price of wheat drops and the bank calls the note. Nora was 18 in 1948 when she had a bus ticket to Wichita and a suitcase packed and a position lined up at a medical records office through a cousin who'd already made the move. She was going to go, she had decided, and then her mother got sick in October of that year. A slow illness that lasted 3 years and required someone at home, and Nora stayed. By the time her mother died in 1951, the farm had reorganized itself around her presence in a way that made leaving feel like abandonment. And she had reorganized herself around the farm in a way that made the bus ticket feel like a different person's idea. She married Harold Tillman in 1953, a neighboring farmer's son who was a decent man and a willing worker, but who had not grown up in a forge shop and who understood from the beginning that Nora's relationship with the Buell land and the Buell tools was not something he had married into so much as something he had been permitted to participate in. Harold died of a heart attack in the winter of 1958 at 41 years old in the South pasture, and Nora found him there at dusk when he didn't come in for supper. After Harold, Nora farmed alone. Her father, Clarence, was still alive in 1961, 76 years old and slower than he'd been, but still present in the shop on good days, still capable of an opinion about the right way to dress a hammer face or the correct temperature for drawing a spring. The farm was paid for. The equipment was paid for. Nora kept a ledger in the same format her father had kept his, a cloth-covered composition book with every expense on the left page and every receipt on the right. And the ledger showed that in the 3 years since Harold's death she had retired the last of the operating debt he'd carried and accumulated $4,200 in a savings account at the Pratt Bank. Not because farming 480 acres of short grass prairie in Pratt County was particularly lucrative, because Nora Tillman did not spend money she hadn't already earned, and she did not borrow money to buy things she could build, and she had inherited from Clarence Buell the understanding that the ledger told the truth about your operation, and that you were better served by the truth than by the comfortable fiction that everything would work out. Now, the windmill. When Nora Tillman looked at that seized Aermotor on the Pratt County estate sale grounds in the spring of 1961, she did not see what everyone else saw. Everyone else saw a broken machine with a snapped pump rod and a gearbox that 2 men couldn't turn, and a tower full of structural rust, and a tail vane that pointed at nothing useful. Nora Tillman saw a 1923 Aermotor Model 702 with a 6-foot wheel diameter, and a cast-iron gearbox that had been built to tolerances that the 1960 steel industry had largely stopped bothering with. And she saw it in a specific location on a specific piece of ground that she had already assessed. Here is what nobody at that estate sale knew. 6 weeks before the sale, in February of 1961, Nora had driven to Wichita and spent 2 days at the public library, reading back issues of the Aermotor Company service bulletins and the USDA's well and windmill maintenance circulars from the 1930s and 1940s. She had taken notes in a pocket notebook, 31 pages of them, covering gearbox disassembly sequences, pump rod sizing charts, drop pipe specifications, and the specific failure modes of the 702 series gearbox, which was known to seize when the oil seal failed and water infiltrated the gear chamber, but which was also known to be rebuildable with standard bearing stock if the gear teeth themselves hadn't been damaged by running dry. She had also, in March of 1961, 3 weeks before the estate sale, driven to a farm equipment salvage yard outside of Hutchinson and purchased for $12 a complete sucker rod assembly and a drop pipe section from a decommissioned Aermotor installation that had been pulled when the farm converted to electric submersible pumping. She had those parts in the equipment shed before she ever set foot at the estate sale. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing impulse. They were watching execution. The windmill sat on the estate property for 3 weeks, while Nora arranged to have the tower disassembled and trucked to the farm. She paid a neighbor's son $40 to help with the disassembly and transport, which she recorded in the ledger as a project. Transport $40. The gearbox came down in one piece, still seized, wrapped in burlap, and set in the bed of the truck with the care you'd give a piece of equipment you intended to resurrect. Let me tell you about the rebuild, because this is where Nora Tillman proved that what her father had given her was not sentiment. It was a set of tools and the knowledge of how to use them. She started in the forge shop in April of 1961, in the evenings after chores, and on Saturdays when the field work allowed. Clarence was there for the first 2 weeks, sitting on a stool near the wood stove, watching and occasionally saying something useful. The shop smelled the same as it always had, coal smoke and cutting oil, and the particular mineral smell of old iron that has been worked and reworked over decades. Her father's tools were where they had always been. The post vise still held a piece of square stock he'd been working the previous autumn, left there when his hands had gotten too stiff to continue. The South Bend lathe had a film of dust on the ways, but the cutting oil was still in the reservoir, and the chuck still turned true. The gearbox came apart in stages. The cast iron housing had to be split at the parting line, which required driving a cold chisel around the circumference with careful measured blows, not cracking the casting, but breaking the rust seal that had formed between the two halves over 11 years of water infiltration. When the housing opened, Nora found what she'd hoped to find. The main drive gear and the crank gear were intact. The teeth damaged only at 2 contact points where the gears had been running dry before they seized, and the damage was localized, not progressive. The bearings were destroyed. Both the main shaft bearing and the crankshaft bearing had corroded into solid masses of rust and disintegrated ball material that had to be drifted out with a punch and hammer. The oil seal was gone as she'd expected, dissolved into a black residue that coated the bottom of the gear chamber. She cleaned the gear chamber with kerosene and a wire brush, then with mineral spirits, then with clean rags until the cast iron was bare. She measured the father's inside micrometer, a Starrett instrument he'd bought in 1929 and kept in a wooden case lined with oilcloth. The main shaft bore measured 375 inches. The crankshaft bore measured 125 inches. She wrote both measurements in the pocket notebook and drove to the bearing supply house in Wichita the following Saturday, where she purchased a matched pair of sealed ball bearings, a main shaft bearing for 60 cents and a crankshaft bearing for 50 cents, and a replacement oil seal for 35 cents. She also purchased a tube of high-temperature bearing grease and a sheet of gasket material for making a new parting line seal. The gear teeth required attention. The 2 damaged contact points had raised burrs that would cause noise and accelerated wear if left alone. Nora addressed them with a hand file, a fine-cut mill bastard file that had been her father's, working slowly and checking the profile against the undamaged teeth until the contact surface was smooth and the profile matched. It took 4 evenings. She did not rush it. The pump rod was the larger problem. The original rod had snapped 6 feet below grade, which meant the broken section was still in the casing, and pulling it required the well service equipment she didn't own. She hired a well service company out of Pratt to pull the casing section and retrieve the broken rod, which cost her $22 and which she recorded in the ledger without comment. With the casing clear, she could assess the drop pipe. The cracked joint she'd seen at the surface was the only damaged section, and she replaced it with the salvage yard pipe she'd bought in March, cutting it to length on the shop's pipe vise and threading the ends with her father's manual pipe threader, a rigid tool with a set of dies that covered every size she was likely to need. The new pump rod was the piece that required the lathe. The salvage yard sucker rod she'd bought in Hutchinson was the right diameter, but 6 and too long for the depth of this installation, and the lower end fitting needed to be remachined to accept the pump cylinder she'd sourced from a different salvage operation, a 1940s Dempster cylinder she'd found in the classified section of the Pratt Tribune for $8. She turned the fitting on the South Bend lathe, taking light cuts to bring the diameter down to the thread specification she'd found in the USDA circular. Cutting the threads with a die from her father's tap and die set, a complete set in a wooden box, with a fitted tray that Clarence had assembled over 20 years of individual purchases. The fit was correct on the first attempt. She checked it 3 times anyway. The tail vane she straightened cold, clamped in the post vise, and bent back with a length of pipe over the handle of a large adjustable wrench, checking the angle with a carpenter's square against a reference line she'd chalked on the shop floor. It wasn't factory perfect. It was within 2 degrees of true, which was close enough to orient the wheel into the wind without fighting itself. The tower went up in June of 1961 with the same neighbor's son and his father helping. The 4 tower legs re-anchored in new concrete, the gearbox reinstalled with the new bearings pressed in place, and the gear chamber filled with fresh oil. The pump rod connected to the cylinder, the drop pipe assembled joint by joint down the casing. Nora climbed the tower herself to connect the gearbox to the wheel assembly. 40 feet above the Pratt County prairie on a June morning, with a steady southwest wind that moved the grass in long, slow waves, she connected the last fitting, climbed down and released the brake. The wheel turned. It turned slowly at first, the gears moving through their new bearings with a smoothness that hadn't been there in 1950 or 1940 or whenever the oil seal had first begun to fail. Then the wind steadied and the wheel came up to speed and the pump rod began its long, slow stroke up and down, 60 strokes a minute in a 15-mile-per-hour wind, and 30 seconds later, water came up the pipe and out the overflow into the stock tank. It was clear water, cold, clean Ogallala water from 180 feet down, the same aquifer that had been under that ground since the Pleistocene, older than the farm, older than the county, older than the state. Dale Tillman, her brother-in-law, had driven out that morning without being asked, apparently having heard through some channel of county information that the windmill was going up. He stood at the fence and watched the wheel turn and watched the water come, and he took his cap off and rubbed the back of his neck, and he didn't say anything for a while. Then he walked over and looked at the gearbox housing and the pump rod connection and the new tail vane, and he said, "Who did the machine work?" Nora said she did. Dale put his cap back on. He said, "Your daddy teach you that?" She said he did. Dale nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's revising something he thought he understood. And he said, "Well, that's something, Nora. That's really something." The cost when she tallied it in the ledger came to this. The windmill itself, $90. Transport and disassembly labor, $40. Salvage sucker rod and drop pipe section, $12. Well service to pull the broken rod from the casing, $22. Main shaft bearing, 60 cents. Crankshaft bearing, 50 cents. Oil seal and gasket material, 55 cents. Bearing grease, 30 cents. Salvage pump cylinder, $8. Gasket and hardware, $4. Tower concrete and hardware, $9. Tower erection labor, $20. Miscellaneous materials, $3.05. Total, $209.95. A new Aermotor installation from a dealer in Pratt, including tower, gearbox, pump, rod, cylinder, and drop pipe, was priced at the time at $740, not including well service and installation labor, which added another $150 to $200 depending on depth. Nora had built a functioning windmill for roughly 22 cents on the dollar against the commercial alternative, using a machine that the county had decided was beyond saving. The word spread differently after Dale's visit. Not the mocking version that had traveled from the feed store to the co-op, to the diner, to the church parking lot in the spring. This version traveled the way farming information travels when it's actually useful. Quietly, directly, farmer to farmer, with the specific detail that the gearbox had been rebuilt on a South Bend lathe using stock bearings, and that the pump rod had been machined to fit a salvage cylinder, and that the whole thing had cost her $210 and was pumping water from 180 feet without complaint. If you have ever watched a community underestimate someone, and then watch that community slowly, quietly revise its understanding without ever quite admitting it was wrong, stick with me. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling, because this is the part of Nora Tillman's story that took 20 years to arrive, and that arrived in a way nobody in Pratt County was prepared for. Let me tell you about what happened over the next 2 decades, because this is where the story stops being about a windmill and starts being about something else entirely. The windmill pumped. That is the simplest way to say it. It pumped in the summer when the southwest wind came up every afternoon, and the stock tanks would have gone dry without it. It pumped in the winter, when the electric lines went down in ice storms and the neighbors with electric submersible pumps were hauling water in tanks on pickup beds to keep cattle alive. It pumped in the dry fall of 1963 and the dry summer of 1966 and the drought years of the early 1970s, when the Ogallala was already beginning to show the first signs of the depletion that the agricultural economists were writing about in journals that most Pratt County farmers didn't read. Nora read them. She had a subscription to 2 agricultural publications, and she read the aquifer depletion data the way her father had read the commodity reports as information about the future that was available now to anyone willing to pay attention. She also kept the ledger. Every year the ledger showed the same thing on the windmill line: 0. No fuel cost, no electricity cost, no repair cost in the first decade because the gearbox she'd rebuilt ran on the original bearings until 1971, when she replaced them again herself for $1.40 in bearing stock and an afternoon in the shop. No service calls, no parts orders, no dealer visits. The electric submersible pumps her neighbors were installing through the 1960s and into the 1970s cost between $400 and $800 to install, and required electricity to run and a service contract to maintain and a dealer to repair when the motor burned out, which happened on average every 7 to 12 years depending on the installation and the water chemistry. Nora's windmill required wind, which Pratt County had in reliable abundance, and occasional attention, which she could provide herself. The savings accumulated, not from the windmill alone, obviously. From the same philosophy applied to every line in the ledger. She didn't buy new equipment when rebuilt equipment would serve. She didn't hire work she could do herself. She didn't borrow for operating expenses. She didn't expand beyond what the land and the operation could support without debt. By 1975, the savings account that had held $4,200 when she bought the windmill held $31,000. By 1979, it held $58,000. She kept it in certificates of deposit at the Pratt Bank, rolling them over at whatever rate the bank was offering. And through the late 1970s, the rates were generous enough that the money was growing faster than she was spending it. Clarence Buell died in 1974 at 89 years old in the house where he'd been born, in a bed that had been his parents' bed. Nora was with him. She buried him in the Pratt County Cemetery next to her mother and Harold, and she went back to the farm, and she kept farming. The shop was hers now. In a way it had always been hers, but was now officially, completely, irrevocably hers. She left his tools where he'd left them. She left the piece of square stock in the post vise. She added her own tools to the bench in the spaces that had always been her spaces, and the shop continued to be what it had always been, the place where broken things became functional again, at a fraction of the cost of replacement. You know what happened in Kansas in the early 1980s. You know what happened across the entire American farm belt. But you know what happened in Kansas specifically if you have any connection to that place or that time. The interest rates climbed to 18% and then past it. The land values that had been rising through the 1970s collapsed in some counties by 40% in 2 years. The commodity prices fell. The operating loans that farmers had taken at variable rates became instruments of destruction. The equipment loans, the land loans, the expansion loans that had seemed manageable at 8% became impossible at 17 and 18%. Farms that had been in families for 3 generations went to auction. The Pratt County Courthouse saw more foreclosure filings in 1982 and 1983 than it had seen since the 1930s. Nora watched this, not with satisfaction, with a quiet sadness that she did not discuss with anyone, because the people losing their farms were not bad farmers. They were not careless people or foolish people. They were people who had made decisions that seemed reasonable when they made them, and that became catastrophic when the conditions changed in ways nobody had predicted, or at least nobody who was selling them the loans had seen fit to mention. The Hendersons, who farmed the section north of her, lost their place in the spring of 1983. The Fenders, who had been in Pratt County since 1909, sold their equipment at auction in the fall of 1982 and walked away from the land rather than wait for the bank to take it. a dairy operation east of town that had put in new electric submersible pumps in 1978 as part of an expansion that was supposed to pay for itself in 5 years, was in receivership by 1981. Nora's expenses didn't change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut because there had never been anything to cut. The windmill didn't have an electric bill. The equipment didn't have loan payments. The land didn't have a mortgage. The operating account carried no debt. When the interest rates climbed to 18%, Nora Tillman's cost of farming in Pratt County was unaffected because she had no variable rate debt. She had the opposite of variable rate debt. She had certificates of deposit rolling over at 16 and 17%, which meant the crisis that was destroying her neighbors was simultaneously increasing the return on her savings. In the fall of 1983, the Henderson place came to auction. 160 acres of Pratt County shortgrass prairie adjacent to Nora's north fence line. Good ground well watered by a creek in the northwest corner and by the aquifer below, with a set of improvements that were in reasonable condition and a windmill of its own. A newer Aermotor installation from 1968 that was in better original condition than the one Nora had bought in 1961. The bank opened the bidding at $240 an acre. There were speculators present from Wichita and one from Oklahoma City. Men in newer trucks who had been circling Pratt County all year looking for distressed land. There were also a handful of local farmers who had survived the crisis with enough credit remaining to consider a purchase, though their bankers were standing behind them with the particular posture of men who intended to be consulted before any bid was finalized. Nora Tillman bid $260 an acre. She bid $280. She bid $310. Which was the number at which the Wichita speculator shook his head and the Oklahoma City man put his card away. The auctioneer called it 160 acres at $310 per acre, $49,600. She wrote a check, not a bank draft requiring prior arrangement, a personal check from the account at the Pratt Bank that held at that moment $67,000, which was the accumulated result of 22 years of farming without debt and maintaining equipment without dealers and pumping water without electricity. She wrote the check at the auction table while the crowd watched. The crowd went quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when they are collectively recalibrating something they thought they understood. Not applause, not cheering. The sound of 200 people rearranging everything they thought they knew about a woman who had paid $90 for a broken windmill in 1961 and had apparently been doing something with the intervening years that none of them had fully accounted for. Dale Tillman was in that crowd. He had been in Pratt County for all of it, had been at the estate sale in 1961 and at the windmill installation in June of that year, and had watched the whole arc of the story without quite understanding what he was watching, until the moment Nora signed the check and the auctioneer handed her the receipt. He found her at her truck afterward. He said, "Nora." She said, "Dale." He said, "Your daddy would have understood this." She said, "I know." He said, "I didn't." She said, "I know that too, Dale." She said it without anger, which was the part he remembered afterward when he told the story. Not that she was right and he was wrong, that she had never been angry about it. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that Clarence Buell would have understood without a word of explanation. Nora Tillman farmed the combined 640 acres for the next 18 years. She added the Henderson windmill to her water system, connecting it to a secondary stock tank she built in the northwest corner of the new pasture. And the two windmills pumped water from the Ogallala for the rest of her farming years without requiring anything she couldn't provide herself. The gearbox on the 1923 Aermotor received its third bearing replacement in 1988 at a cost of $2. Tens in bearing stock in the same shop on the same South Bend lathe, using the same Starrett micrometer her father had bought in 1929. The cutting oil was still in the reservoir. It was always still in the reservoir. Her niece, Yoellen Ball, came to the farm in the summer of 1994 at the age of 14, the daughter of Nora's younger brother, sent for the summer because the family in Wichita thought the girl needed something to do and because Nora had mentioned once that she could use help. Yoellen arrived expecting to feed chickens and pull weeds. What she found was a forge shop with a coal fire and a post vise and a South Bend lathe and an aunt who could explain in plain language exactly why every tool in that shop was shaped the way it was, and what it was designed to do, and how to hold it, and how to read the work. By the end of that summer, Joellen could file a gear tooth profile to within 1/1000th of an inch, and thread a pipe end, and press a bearing into a housing without damaging the race. She came back the following summer and the summer after that. In 1999, the Pratt County Farm Bureau asked Nora to speak at their annual meeting. She was 69 years old. She stood at the podium in the Pratt County Fairground Meeting Hall, and she spoke for 11 minutes without notes. She talked about the windmill. She talked about what it had cost, and what the alternative would have cost, and what the difference between those two numbers had meant over 38 years. She talked about the 1983 land purchase and what had made it possible. She talked about her father's shop and what she had learned there, and what she had been able to do because of what she had learned there. And then she said something that the people in that room remembered for a long time afterward. She said, "People looked at my windmill and saw junk. I looked at their payment books and saw the same thing. A paid-for windmill and a paid-for farm are the only things a bank cannot take from you. Everything else is just borrowing time." Dale Tillman was in the audience. He was 71 years old, and he had been farming Pratt County for 50 years, and he had heard a great many speeches at a great many Farm Bureau meetings. And he said later that this was the only one he had ever written down. He wrote it on the back of the program. He kept the program. Joanne Buell took over the farm operation in 2001. She was 21 years old. She had a paid-for farm and a forge shop and a South Bend lathe and 2 functioning Aermotor windmills and a ledger habit she'd learned from her aunt the same way her aunt had learned it from Clarence Buell. The 1923 Aermotor was still running. It ran through the drought of 2002, which was the worst single-year drought in Pratt County since the 1950s, and through the extended dry period that followed, and it pumped water on every day that the wind blew, which in Pratt County is most days. The electric submersible pumps on the neighboring operations failed twice during that period. Once during a 3-day power outage in August of 2002, when a transmission line went down in a thunderstorm, and the utility company couldn't restore service for 72 hours, and once during a hard winter in 2003, when a motor burned out, and the service company was backed up 2 weeks on repair calls. Both times, Joellen's cattle drank from the stock tanks fed by the windmills, and both times the neighboring farmers came to her fence line with their hats in their hands and asked if they could run a temporary line to her tank, and both times she said yes. What do you see when you look at a seized windmill with 8 of 12 blades and a snapped pump rod and a gearbox that 2 men couldn't turn? Most people see a scrap dealer's problem. Nora Tillman saw 180 feet of Ogallala water and a cast iron gearbox built to tolerances that the industry had stopped bothering with. And she saw it in a county where the wind blows 300 days a year and electricity comes on a line that goes down in ice storms. That's not a different opinion about the windmill. That's a different way of seeing. $90, a seized Aermotor, a forge shop, and a South Bend lathe and a Starrett micrometer in a wooden box. The windmill nobody could fix pumping water for 38 years. In the hands of the woman, nobody understood until the water kept coming, and the check cleared, and the crowd went quiet.